What if I told you the most decorated general in American history was destroyed by his own government for telling the truth, not by the Nazis he defeated, not by the enemy he fought, but by Washington, because he saw what was coming and refused to stay quiet? This happened. The evidence exists, and they've been hiding it for almost 80 years.
They found him paralyzed in the back of a Cadillac on a quiet Sunday morning in December, 1945. America's most decorated general, the man who had driven Hitler's armies to their knees, lay bleeding and broken after what officials called a simple traffic accident. But in the weeks before his death, George Patton had said something that terrified Washington. He'd discovered a truth about the war they'd just won, about the enemies they'd chosen and the enemies they'd made. And he wouldn't stop talking. Some say the accident was convenient. Others whisper it was necessary. What we know for certain is this: Harry Truman wanted him silenced. And 12 days after that crash, Patton was dead. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. Let's go back to where it started, to the fields of France in 1918, where two young American officers discovered they were made of the same iron. Harry Truman commanded an artillery battery. George Patton led tanks into battle. They weren't friends exactly, but they were brothers in a way only combat makes possible. When the shells fell and the earth shook and men died screaming in the mud, these two fought side by side. They fired some of the last shots of World War I together, their guns aimed at German positions just hours before the armistice. Both men thought they understood war. Both believed they were fighting for something pure and true. But 27 years later, when their paths crossed again at the end of another world war, everything had changed. Truman sat in the White House, thrust into power by Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death. Patton commanded the Third Army, having carved a bloody path through Nazi Germany. One man now wielded political power beyond measure. The other commanded loyalty from soldiers who would die for him without question. And between them grew a chasm so deep, so fundamental, that only one could survive it. The question nobody asks is why. Why did Truman, a man who respected military valor above almost everything, come to see Patton as a threat? Why did he support decisions that stripped America's greatest combat general of command and dignity? The answer lies not in what Patton did on the battlefield, but in what he said afterward, when victory revealed truths more disturbing than anything either man had witnessed in war. May 1945. The guns, finally, stopped. Nazi Germany lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies shattered, its foe dead by his own hand. American soldiers danced in the streets of Europe. Families back home wept with relief. The newspapers declared total victory, complete triumph over evil itself. But George Patton wasn't celebrating, while other generals planned their returns home. Their victory parades and book deals and comfortable retirements, Patton stood in the wreckage of Bavaria and felt something he'd never experienced before. Dread, not the clean fear of combat, but something deeper and more corrosive. He looked at the maps, at the new lines being drawn across Europe, and he saw with horrifying clarity that they'd made a terrible mistake. The Soviet Union, America's ally in name, had swallowed half of Europe. Red Army soldiers occupied Berlin, Warsaw, Prague, Budapest. Joseph Stalin, a dictator whose body count exceeded Hitler's, now controlled territories spanning from the Pacific to the heart of Germany. Patton watched Soviet troops brutalizing civilians, looting cities, establishing the infrastructure of totalitarian control. He saw the future taking shape, and it looked like another war, one America might not win. So he said something that would echo through history, words that would mark him for destruction. We defeated the wrong enemy. Think about what that means. Patton, who'd devoted years to crushing Nazi Germany, who'd lost thousands of men in that crusade, was saying they'd targeted the wrong threat. He wasn't defending Hitler's regime. He was warning that Stalin's Soviet Union represented something potentially worse, and that by exhausting themselves against Germany, the Western Allies had enabled an even greater evil. Truman heard these words in Washington, and they landed like a grenade in the Oval Office. The president had inherited Roosevelt's grand alliance with Stalin, built on the premise that the Soviet Union was a partner in creating post-war peace. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences had divided Europe based on this partnership, American policy, American credibility. The entire architecture of the post-war world rested on the assumption that Stalin could be trusted, or at least managed. And now Patton, with his famous mouth and his complete inability to practice diplomacy, was calling it all a lie. But it got worse. Patton didn't just criticize policy. He advocated action. In private meetings with other generals, in conversations that were reported back to Washington, Patton argued that America should rearm German prisoners, combine them with American forces, and drive the Soviets back to their borders while the Western armies were still mobilized and strong. It was madness by conventional standards. The American people were exhausted. They wanted their boys home. The thought of continuing the war, especially alongside German soldiers, was politically impossible and morally repugnant to a nation that had just sacrificed everything to defeat those same Germans. But Patton saw it differently. He believed that within a few years, the Soviet Union would be too strong to challenge, that Stalin would solidify control over Eastern Europe, and that the world would face decades of Cold War confrontation, or worse. History, of course, proved him right about the Cold War. Whether his proposed solution would have worked or would have triggered World War III is something we'll never know. What matters is that Truman couldn't allow this kind of talk to continue. Now here's where the story gets darker, where we have to talk about what Patton said next. The words that truly sealed his fate. In September 1945, as military governor of Bavaria, Patton held a press conference that should have been routine. Reporters asked about denazification, the Allied policy of removing Nazi party members from positions of power in government, business, education, and administration. It was popular policy back home. Americans wanted Nazis punished. The images from concentration camps had horrified the world. The Nuremberg trials were being prepared. Justice demanded that those who'd participated in Hitler's regime face consequences. But Patton, standing before those reporters, said something that detonated like an atomic bomb across American media. He said the Nazi Party was just like the Democratic and Republican parties back home that most Germans had joined for practical reasons, not ideological commitment, and that removing all party members from administrative positions made it impossible to govern effectively. He said, and these are his actual words, "More than half the German people were Nazis, and we would be in a hell of a fix if we removed all Nazi party members from office." The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Newspapers crucified him. Editorial boards demanded his removal. Jewish organizations, rightfully outraged, called for his court-martial. And in the White House, Harry Truman made a decision. Not immediately, not publicly. But the decision was made. Patton had become a liability, a loose cannon who threatened American policy and insulted the values that millions had died defending. The question was only how to handle it. But before we get to what Truman did, we need to understand something crucial about Patton's actual position. Because here's where history gets complicated, where simplistic narratives about good guys and bad guys start to crumble. Patton wasn't defending Nazism. His record makes that clear. His armies had liberated concentration camps. He'd seen the evidence of genocide firsthand and been sickened by it. What Patton was describing, however clumsily and offensively, was a genuine administrative problem. The Nazi Party had been so thoroughly integrated into German society that removing every member did create chaos. Teachers, engineers, clerical workers, local administrators. Millions of ordinary Germans had joined the party because refusing meant losing your job, endangering your family, or worse. Were they all guilty? Were they all evil? These were complicated questions that demanded nuanced answers. But America in 1945 didn't want nuance. The nation wanted moral clarity. They wanted Nazis to be monsters and Americans to be heroes, and anyone who suggested otherwise was suspect. Patton's comparison to American political parties was spectacularly offensive in its equation of normal political affiliation with membership in a genocidal regime. But beneath the offensive rhetoric lay a real question. How do you govern a defeated nation when its entire administrative class is tainted by collaboration? Do you pursue perfect justice and risk total collapse? Or do you make compromises that enable stability but feel like betrayal? Truman's administration had already made its choice. Denazification would proceed, strictly and publicly, regardless of practical challenges. Patton's questioning of that policy wasn't just insubordinate. It undermined the moral foundation of occupation policy. Eisenhower got the phone call first. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Patton's boss, his protector throughout the war. The man who'd defended him through the slapping incidents in Sicily and every other controversy. Ike had saved Patton's career multiple times, believing that his tactical genius outweighed his political stupidity. But this time was different. The pressure from Washington was immense. Truman's administration made clear that Patton had to go. Eisenhower, ever the political general, understood what needed to happen. On September 28, 1945, Patton was summoned to Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt. The meeting was private, but we know what happened from Patton's diary and later accounts. Eisenhower, wearing his famous grin but with steel in his eyes, told Patton his comments had embarrassed the army, and embarrassed Ike personally, and created an impossible situation. Patton was being relieved of command of the Third Army, the force he'd led from Normandy to Czechoslovakia, the men who worshipped him as a god of war. Instead, he'd be given command of the 15th Army, which was really just a paper organization, tasked with writing the history of the European campaign. It was a humiliation disguised as a lateral move. Patton, proud and stubborn, initially resisted. He insisted the press had distorted his words, that he'd been misquoted, that he was being punished for telling uncomfortable truths. But Eisenhower was immovable. The decision had been made at levels above both of them. On October 7, 1945, in a ceremony that must have broken his heart, Patton handed over command of the Third Army. Soldiers who'd fought under him wept openly. He tried to maintain dignity, but everyone present knew they were witnessing the destruction of a legend. Now we have to ask the question that haunts this story. What was Truman's actual role? Because here's what the official history tells us. Eisenhower made the decision to relieve Patton. It was a military matter, handled through military channels. Truman, as president, wasn't directly involved. But that's not quite true, is it? Presidents don't micromanage military assignments, but they set policy. They create the political environment in which decisions are made. And Truman had made his position clear. In private conversations, in meetings with his advisors, Truman expressed contempt for Patton's judgment and character. He believed Patton was a brilliant combat commander who'd become dangerous in peacetime. A man who couldn't understand that the rules had changed, that diplomacy now mattered more than firepower. Truman's administration supported the Nazification and partnership with the Soviet Union, at least publicly. Patton threatened both policies. More that Truman saw in Patton something that terrified any democratic leader, a general with the loyalty of his troops and the willingness to defy civilian authority. Patton had suggested, however carefully, that American policy was wrong and that he knew better. That's a line no president can allow a general to cross, not because of ego, but because civilian control of the military is the foundation of democratic government. If generals start making foreign policy, deciding which wars to fight and which enemies to engage, you don't have a democracy anymore. You have a military junta. Truman understood this, so when the pressure built to remove Patton, when the newspapers demanded action, and the political costs of defending him became too high, Truman didn't need to give explicit orders. He just needed to make clear that Patton had to go, and the military hierarchy would handle the details. What happened next is where the story enters truly dark territory, where speculation meets circumstantial evidence, and where we have to be very careful about distinguishing fact from conspiracy theory. After losing the Third Army, Patton was assigned to command the 15th Army in Bad Nauheim, a nothing job designed to keep him quiet and out of the way until his planned return to America in December. He was scheduled to sail home on December 14th, 1945, likely to retire quietly and fade from public consciousness. But Patton didn't fade quietly. In his final weeks in Germany, he became more outspoken, more bitter, more willing to say things that enraged Washington. He wrote in his diary and in letters to his wife that he felt betrayed by Eisenhower and the army, that he'd been sacrificed for political expediency. He continued to warn about the Soviet threat, continued to criticize denazification, and began to hint at even more controversial positions. He expressed anti-Semitic views that were appalling, even by the standards of that era. He compared displaced Jews in refugee camps unfavorably to Germans. He suggested that Jewish refugees were exaggerating their suffering and exploiting American sympathy. These statements went beyond political disagreement. They revealed an ugliness that destroyed whatever sympathy remained for him in Washington. Truman, briefed on Patton's continued provocations, reportedly said that the man had become an embarrassment and a liability. Some historians believe Truman considered having Patton court-martialed or at least formally censured. But then, on December 9, 1945, just 5 days before his scheduled departure for home, George Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. The official story is simple and probably true. Patton was riding in his Cadillac staff car with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, when an army truck turned suddenly in front of them. The vehicles collided. The driver and General Gay suffered minor injuries, but Patton, sitting in the back seat, was thrown forward violently, striking his head and neck on the car's interior. His neck was broken. His spinal cord was severed. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was rushed to a hospital in Heidelberg, where doctors determined his injuries were catastrophic but not immediately fatal. His wife Beatrice was flown from America to be with him. For 12 days, Patton lingered, lucid but immobilized, knowing he would never walk again. Never ride a horse, never command troops. On December 21st, 1945, he died of an embolism. The army buried him with full military honors in the American cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside thousands of Third Army soldiers who died in combat. The investigation into the accident found no evidence of foul play. The truck driver, technician 5th grade Robert Thompson, was determined to have made an improper turn, but there was no suggestion of intentional action. It was ruled an accident. Tragic but unremarkable in its and yet, people have asked questions ever since. Patton had survived years of combat without serious injury. He'd led from the front, exposed himself to enemy fire repeatedly, and emerged unscathed. Now, weeks before returning home, he dies in a minor traffic accident. The timing seemed almost impossibly convenient for an administration that wanted him silenced, but could anyone figure out how to do it without making him a martyr? Let us be clear about something. There is no credible evidence that Patton's death was anything other than an accident. No documents have emerged suggesting assassination. No deathbed confessions. No smoking guns. The conspiracy theories that surround his death are built on coincidence, speculation, and the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But here's why the theories persist. Why they won't die. Because Patton's death solved problems for a lot of powerful people. It eliminated a vocal critic of American policy toward the Soviets, just as the Cold War was beginning. It prevented Patton from returning home and potentially becoming a political figure, maybe even running for office on an anti-communist platform. It ended the embarrassment of his increasingly extreme statements before they could do more damage. And it happened through an accident that, while statistically unlikely for someone of Patton's status, wasn't impossible. Suspicious minds note that the driver of the truck that hit Patton's car was never seriously investigated, that his identity and background remained somewhat murky, that he disappeared from public record after the incident. They point out that the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, were active in occupied Germany and would have had both motive and means to eliminate a general calling for war against the Soviet Union. They note that American intelligence services, still in their infancy but already learning dark tradecraft, might have decided Patton was a national security risk. These theories can't be proven, but they also can be entirely dismissed, because we know now what the public didn't know then, that intelligence agencies do assassinate people, that governments do eliminate inconvenient figures, that the early Cold War era was filled with covert operations, false flags, and manufactured accidents. So what did Truman really think of Patton? The historical record gives us fragments, hints, but not the full picture. Truman never wrote extensively about Patton in his memoirs. He never gave interviews explaining his views on the general. What we have are second-hand reports, private comments relayed by aides, and the policy decisions that spoke louder than words. Truman respected Patton's military achievements. He understood that Patton had been instrumental in winning the war, but he also saw him as fundamentally unsuited for the post-war world, a man trapped in outdated thinking, unable to adapt to new realities. Truman believed in the alliance with the Soviet Union, at least initially. He thought Stalin could be managed, that cooperation was possible, that another war could be avoided through diplomacy. Patton's warmongering, his calls to attack the Soviets while they were still allies, seemed not just wrong but dangerous. Truman also couldn't tolerate Patton's insubordination. Presidents need generals who will execute policy, not question it publicly. Patton had crossed that line repeatedly. More personally, there are hints that Truman simply didn't like Patton. Truman came from humble origins, worked his way up, valued plain-spoken honesty over flamboyant showmanship. Patton was wealthy, aristocratic, theatrical in a way that Truman found distasteful. Where Patton saw a warrior poet, Truman saw a spoiled prima donna. Where Patton saw himself speaking hard truths, Truman saw a narcissist who couldn't shut up. The personal dislike made the political necessity easier. When the time came to remove Patton from power, Truman didn't hesitate. He didn't intervene to save him. He let it happen, and when Patton died weeks later, Truman issued a perfunctory statement of condolence and moved on. There's no evidence he lost sleep over it. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. Patton was right about some things, not about everything. His statements on denazification were offensive and politically stupid. His anti-Semitism was inexcusable. His desire to immediately fight the Soviet Union was probably impractical and certainly unpopular. But his core warning about Soviet intentions? History proved him correct. Within 3 years of his death, the Soviet Union had imposed totalitarian control over Eastern Europe. Show trials, purges, secret police, the whole apparatus of Stalinist terror descended on Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. The Berlin blockade of 1948 nearly triggered World War III. The Korean War demonstrated that Stalin was willing to use force to expand communist control. The Cold War that Patton predicted became the defining reality of the second half of the 20th century, consuming trillions of dollars and millions of lives in proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, and ideological struggle. Patton saw it coming before almost anyone else in American leadership. He understood that Stalin was not a partner, but a predator, that the Soviet Union would exploit every weakness, that the window for confronting Soviet expansionism was closing. Now, thus being right to vindicate his proposed solution. That's debatable. A war against the Soviet Union in 1945, even with American military superiority, would have been catastrophic. The Soviet Union had millions of troops in the field, battle-hardened and fanatically motivated. American forces were exhausted and desperate to go home. The American public would never have supported continuing the war, and most crucially, such a war might have gone nuclear, as both sides raced to develop atomic weapons. Patton's instinct was correct, but his solution might have led to apocalypse. What Truman understood, and what Patton couldn't accept, was that politics must constrain military action. You can't always do what's strategically optimal if it's politically impossible. Democracy requires consensus, patience, the willingness to accept imperfect solutions. Patton was a warrior who saw problems in terms of enemies to be destroyed and victories to be won. Truman was a politician who understood that power is always limited, that public support matters, that sometimes you have to accept bad outcomes because the alternatives are worse. This fundamental difference in worldview made conflict inevitable. Patton couldn't survive in the world. Truman was building a world of diplomacy, deterrence, containment, and compromise. He was a man built for total war, thrust into an era of limited wars and proxy conflicts. His tools no longer fit the task. His instincts, however sharp, couldn't navigate the complexities of nuclear-age geopolitics, so Truman and Eisenhower and the rest of the post-war leadership eased him out. Stripped him of power, relegated him to a They did it gradually and carefully, trying to preserve his reputation while ending his influence. And then fate intervened with a car accident that finished the job more thoroughly than any political maneuver could have. Whether you believe that accident was truly random or something darker, the effect was the same. George Patton was silenced permanently, just when his voice was becoming most dangerous to the established order. The man who helped save democracy from fascism was ultimately destroyed by the democratic system. He fought to preserve, because that system couldn't tolerate the threat he posed to civilian authority and diplomatic policy. In the end, what Truman thought of Patton might be less important than what Patton's fate reveals about power itself. This is the real lesson, the disturbing truth that echoes through history. Democratic governments, even good ones led by decent men, will destroy anyone who threatens their control. Not through murder necessarily, though that's always possible. Usually through subtler means. Reputation, destruction, professional marginalization, bureaucratic exile. The machine protects itself. It must, because allowing dissent from within the power structure invites chaos and collapse. Patton wasn't killed for being wrong. He was destroyed for being inconvenient. His analysis of Soviet intentions was largely correct. His warnings about postwar policy were prescient. But he said these things at the wrong time, in the wrong way, when the wrong people were listening. He challenged the narrative that Washington needed to project. He threatened the delicate diplomatic balance that Truman's administration was trying to maintain so he had to go. The method didn't matter. The justification could be found. Public opinion could be managed. And once the decision was made, the machine executed it with cold efficiency. First, through official channels, relieving him of command and humiliating him publicly. Then through isolation and marginalization, stripping away his support structure and relevance. And finally, perhaps through accident, or perhaps through something darker, through his death in a car crash that ended all possibility of his continuing to cause problems. We tell ourselves that this couldn't happen in America, that we don't liquidate inconvenient generals, that we're different from the totalitarian regimes we fought against. But are we? When someone threatens the established order, when someone with power and following starts saying things the leadership can't tolerate, what happens? They're discredited, marginalized, and removed from influence. Usually, that's enough. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes people die at convenient moments. And we accept the official explanations because the alternative is too disturbing. Because admitting that our government might eliminate its own heroes would shatter our faith in the institutions we depend on. But hear us. What we know for certain. Harry Truman presided over a system that decided George Patton was more valuable dead than alive, or at least more valuable silenced than speaking. Whether that meant facilitating his actual death or just his professional death doesn't change the fundamental calculation. Patton was a problem. The problem was solved, and the world moved on, building the Cold War architecture that Patton had predicted, fighting the conflicts he'd warned about, but without him. His voice was erased from the conversation at the exact moment it might have mattered most. That's not democracy. That's not justice. That's power protecting itself, the way it always does, the way it always will. The machine doesn't care about truth. It cares about control. And anyone who threatens that control, no matter how right they are, no matter what they've sacrificed, will be ground up and spit out. Patton learned this lesson in the back of a Cadillac on a quiet Sunday morning in Germany, 78 years ago. The question is, have we learned it? Do we understand what his death meant? Or are we still telling ourselves comfortable stories about accidents and coincidences? Because the truth is too dark to face.